I'll create a realistic, engaging story about real crimes that inspired the scariest movies, set in the USA, following your synopsis with three main characters: a filmmaker, a criminologist, and an investigative journalist. The story will be delivered in English across 4 interconnected chapters of approximately 100 words each, with a focus on authenticity and emotional depth. Real crimes that inspired the scariest movies. Chapter 1. The cold November air cut through Daniel Foster's thin jacket as he stood outside the abandoned Blackwood Sanitarium in upstate New York. 38 years old, with prematurely graying temples, Daniel had spent the last decade making modestly successful horror films, but nothing that had broken through to mainstream acclaim. His camera captured the decrepit facade as the setting sun cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds. "This is where it happened," he muttered to himself, reviewing the grainy footage on his viewfinder. Patient 217 murdered 3 staff members before disappearing into the surrounding forest. The story had fascinated him since film school, not because of its brutality, but because of how it had been sanitized and reimagined in Dark Water Asylum, a 1980s slasher film that had launched a franchise. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Eliza Morales, the criminologist he'd met at a true crime convention in Chicago last month. Her text was characteristically direct. "Found something on the Blackwood case. Original police files. Call me." Daniel's pulse quickened. For his new documentary series, Nightmares Made Real, he needed more than just urban legends. He needed facts, evidence, and the uncomfortable truth behind Hollywood's most terrifying films. Eliza might be his best chance at uncovering something substantial. Meanwhile, in Boston, Mark Reynolds hunched over his laptop in the cramped office of The Investigator, an independent news outlet specializing in long-form journalism. At 42, Mark had the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much and the determination of a man who couldn't stop looking. His wall was covered with printouts, photographs, and red string connecting seemingly unrelated horror films to actual crimes. "You're still working on that horror movie piece?" His editor, Samantha, placed a coffee on his desk. "Deadline's Friday." "I know," Mark replied, not looking up from his screen. "But there's something here, Sam. These similarities between the Westfield murders and The Collector can't be coincidences. The director knew details that weren't public." Samantha sighed. "Just don't go down another rabbit hole. Last time you did that, you nearly had a breakdown." Mark nodded absently, already lost in his research again. What had started as a feature about horror movies based on true events had evolved into something darker. He had uncovered patterns, filmmakers with access to crime scene photos never released to the public, dialogue that mirrored victims' final words, and in some cases, murders that happened after the films were released, mimicking scenes with eerie precision. In New Haven, Connecticut, Dr. Eliza Morales sorted through archived case files in her university office. At 35, she had built her academic reputation on analyzing the psychological profiles of infamous killers. Her latest research project focused on the relationship between media portrayal and criminal psychology, specifically how horror films based on true crimes affected public perception and potentially inspired copycat killings. The Blackwood Sanitarium case was particularly intriguing. The official record stated that in 1977, a patient named Joseph Keller had killed 3 staff members during an escape attempt. His body was never found. The case inspired Dark Water Asylum, which took significant creative liberties, transforming Keller into a supernatural entity that fed on fear. Eliza's phone rang. It was Daniel. "I got your message," he said. "What did you find?" The original investigating officer kept personal notes that never made it into the official report, Eliza explained, her voice low, despite being alone in her office. According to him, there was evidence suggesting Keller had help from someone on the outside, possibly a former doctor who had been conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. That's not in any of the film adaptations, Daniel replied, excitement evident in his voice. There's more, Eliza continued. 2 years after the film was released, there were 3 murders at a psychiatric hospital in Oregon. The killer left messages referencing Darkwater Asylum at each scene. The connection sent a chill down Daniel's spine. I need to see those notes, and I want to interview you for the documentary. Eliza hesitated. Daniel, there's something else you should know. I've been in contact with another journalist investigating this, Mark Reynolds. He believes there's a pattern of filmmakers having access to information they shouldn't have, as if someone is feeding them details. Daniel's excitement faltered. Competition was the last thing he needed. We should meet. All 3 of us compare notes. I'll reach out to Mark, Eliza agreed. But Daniel, be careful. The more I dig into these connections, the more I wonder if some stories are better left untold. As night fell across the eastern seaboard, the 3 individuals continued their separate investigations, unaware that their collective research was drawing the attention of others. In a dimly lit room in Los Angeles, a figure reviewed security footage showing Daniel at the Blackwood Sanitarium, Eliza accessing the archived files, and Mark's computer screen with his elaborate connection web. The figure picked up a phone. They're getting close, a voice said softly. All 3 of them. What should we do? The response from the other end was simple. Watch them. Let's see how much they actually discover. They might be useful. The game was beginning. Truth and fiction were about to collide in ways none of them could anticipate, blurring the lines between documenting horror and living it. Chapter 2. 3 days later, Mark Reynolds found himself in a quiet cafe in Manhattan, seated across from Daniel Foster and Dr. Eliza Morales. Steam rose from their untouched coffees as they sized each other up, 3 strangers connected by an unsettling web of research. So you're making a documentary series, Mark began, studying Daniel's face, about horror movies based on real crimes. Daniel nodded. And you're writing an exposé on the same topic. Quite a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences anymore, Mark replied, opening his laptop. Not after what I've found. Eliza leaned forward. Before we share information, we need to establish trust. I'm only here because both of you have uncovered elements that complement my research. Mark turned his laptop around. On screen was a spreadsheet with dozens of horror films, their release dates, the crimes that inspired them, and subsequent similar crimes that occurred after the film's releases. I've been tracking this pattern for 18 months, he explained. It started when I interviewed the director of Cold Harvest, that slasher film about the Millfield butcher. He described crime scene details that were never released to the public. Daniel's brow furrowed. How would he have access to that information? Exactly, Mark nodded. When I pressed him, he claimed he had consultants who helped with authenticity. But these weren't just police consultants. Someone gave him photographs, journals, actual evidence that should have been locked away. Eliza pulled out her own files. I found similar inconsistencies in at least 7 major cases, film representations containing details only the killer would know. But that's not all, Mark continued, his voice dropping. In at least 12 instances, murders mimicking scenes from these films occurred within a year of release. Not just inspired by the movies, exact reproductions, down to details that weren't even in the films, but were in the original crimes. A heavy silence fell over the table. Daniel felt a cold sensation creeping up his spine. You're suggesting some kind of, conspiracy? Filmmakers with access to killers? Copycat murderers with inside information? I don't know yet, Mark admitted, but I believe someone is using these films to communicate, maybe to inspire, maybe to instruct. Eliza shook her head. That's a dangerous allegation without concrete evidence. Which is why I need access to your criminal psychology background and his filmmaking connections. Mark gestured toward Daniel. Together, we might see the full picture. Daniel hesitated, then pulled out his phone. 2 weeks ago, I received this email. He displayed a message from an anonymous sender containing a link to a cloud drive. It had location details for 5 crime scenes, all of which inspired famous horror films. Plus shooting schedules showing the directors of those films visited each location before production began. "Who sent it?" Eliza asked. "The sender called themselves the Curator. When I tried to respond, the email address no longer existed." Mark's expression darkened. "I received similar information 6 months ago, same signature." Eliza's phone buzzed with a text. Her face paled as she read it. "It's from an unknown number." She turned the phone toward them. The message simply read, "3 seekers at the table. The Curator is watching. Be careful what you unearth." They instinctively looked around the cafe. A few students typing on laptops, an elderly couple sharing a pastry, a businessman on his phone. Nothing suspicious. "We're being watched," Mark whispered. "Or someone's trying to scare us off," Daniel countered, though his confident tone didn't match the unease in his eyes. Eliza closed her files. "I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. My hotel room has a conference area." As they gathered their belongings, Daniel's phone rang. The caller ID showed Blackwood Sanitarium Archives. "Hello?" he answered. "Mr. Foster?" A woman's voice, professionally detached. "This is Margaret Winters from the Blackwood Historical Society. You requested access to our records regarding the 1977 incident?" "Yes, that's right. We've reviewed your request. Unfortunately, those records were removed from our archives 20 years ago by federal authorities. However, one of our former administrators left a personal collection that might interest you. It contains unofficial documents about patient 217. Daniel's pulse quickened. "I'd be very interested in seeing those." "Excellent. They're being held in a private collection in Ravenwood, about 2 hours north of the city. I can arrange access for tomorrow morning." After confirming details, Daniel hung up and relayed the conversation to his new colleagues. "Ravenwood?" Mark frowned. "That's not far from where they filmed the external shots for Darkwater Asylum." "Could be a trap," Eliza warned. "Or it could be the evidence we need," Daniel countered. "Either way, I'm going. You're both welcome to join me." Mark nodded immediately. "I'm in." Eliza hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. "My academic reputation would be at risk if this turns out to be nothing more than conspiracy theories." She paused, then straightened her shoulders. "But if we're right, people need to know. I'll come." As they left the cafe, none of them noticed the businessman watching them, nor did they see him make a call once they were out of sight. "They've agreed to pool their research," he reported, "and they're heading to Ravenwood tomorrow." The voice on the other end was pleased. "Perfect. Everything is proceeding according to design. Make sure the archive is prepared for their arrival." In her hotel room that evening, Eliza spread crime scene photographs across the bed, comparing them with film stills Daniel had provided. The similarities were undeniable, not just in the obvious elements, but in tiny details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the crimes could have known. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "The Curator has been collecting for decades. You're now part of the collection." Across town, Mark stared at his evidence wall in his temporary rental, adding new connections based on Daniel's information. The pattern was growing clearer, stretching back nearly 50 years. Not random similarities, but a deliberate orchestrated dialogue between real violence and fictional horror. And in his hotel suite, Daniel reviewed footage from his visit to Blackwood Sanitarium, noticing for the first time a figure watching him from a distant window. A window in a section of the building that was supposed to be condemned and inaccessible. None of them slept well that night, each haunted by the growing certainty that they had stumbled onto something far larger and more sinister than a series of macabre coincidences. Chapter 3. The drive to Ravenwood took them through increasingly rural landscape, autumn colors fading to the muted browns of early winter. Daniel drove, with Mark navigating, and Eliza in the back seat reviewing her notes. "The address is just ahead," Mark said, pointing to a turnoff. Oakwood Private Library and Archive. The building that came into view was not what any of them expected. Rather than some small local historical society, they found themselves approaching an imposing Victorian mansion converted into a private research facility surrounded by meticulously maintained grounds. "This doesn't look like a typical archive," Eliza commented, unease evident in her voice. "Nothing about this investigation has been typical," Daniel replied, parking in the small lot. A woman in her 50s greeted them at the entrance. "Mr. Foster, I'm Margaret Winters. We spoke on the phone. These must be your colleagues." After introductions, she led them through the main building, which housed an impressive collection of rare books and manuscripts. "The Blackwood materials are kept in our special collections room. The owner of this facility has a particular interest in institutions like Blackwood Sanitarium, places with troubled histories that have influenced our cultural understanding of horror." "Who owns this place?" Mark asked. Journalist instincts piqued. "The Ravenwood Foundation," Margaret answered smoothly. "A private educational trust. Now, through here, please." She led them to a secured room, requiring a keycard for entry. Inside, climate-controlled cases contained documents, photographs, and artifacts. Margaret directed them to a table where several boxes waited. These contained Dr. Victor Slater's personal files from his time at Blackwood. He was the chief psychiatrist during the 1977 incident. The Foundation acquired them after his death in 1998. You'll find his unofficial case notes on patient 217, Joseph Keller, as well as correspondence with colleagues about the case. "Were these files ever made available to law enforcement?" Eliza asked. Margaret's expression remained neutral. "Dr. Slater kept these separate from official records. He had concerns about certain treatments being administered at Blackwood. I'll leave you to your research. There's a buzzer if you need assistance." After she left, they exchanged glances before opening the first box. Inside were meticulously organized folders containing handwritten notes, typed reports, and photographs. "Look at this," Daniel said, lifting a folder labeled Keller J. Special Treatment Protocol. Inside was a detailed log of experimental treatments administered to patient 217, signed off by a doctor. Lawrence Crane, a name not mentioned in any official records. Eliza examined psychiatric evaluations. According to these, Keller wasn't violent before entering Blackwood. He was admitted for severe depression following his wife's death. But these later notes describe increasing aggression and paranoia. Mark was reviewing correspondence. "Listen to this. A letter from Slater to the hospital board, dated 3 months before the killings. I must formally object to Dr. Crane's continued experimentation. His methods go beyond conventional treatment and border on psychological torture. Patient 217 has shown concerning changes in personality that I believe directly result from these unauthorized sessions." Daniel found photographs documenting Keller's deterioration. From a gaunt but ordinary-looking man to someone barely recognizable, with hollow eyes and the expression of detached malice. "There's more," Mark continued, pulling out additional papers. Slater suspected Crane was using patients to test a theory about induced psychopathy, essentially trying to create violent offenders through systematic psychological breakdown. "But that's not in any of the movies," Daniel noted. "Even Darkwater Asylum portrayed Keller as inherently evil." "Because it's too disturbing," Eliza replied. "Fiction needs clear villains. The idea that ordinary people can be deliberately transformed into killers through medical abuse doesn't make for simple horror narratives." As they continued examining the files, a disturbing pattern emerged. Dr. Crane had worked at multiple institutions over a 20-year period, each of which experienced violent incidents involving patients under his care. Several of these incidents later inspired horror films. "He was creating real-life horror stories," Daniel whispered, the implications settling heavily around them. Mark pulled out a photograph that made them all freeze. a group picture of hospital staff from 1975. In it, Dr. Crane stood smiling beside a younger man labelled as A. Winters, administrative assistant. Winters, Eliza repeated. Like Margaret Winters. Daniel quickly searched on his phone. The director of Dark Water Asylum was Alexander Winters, who worked as a hospital administrator before entering film school in 1978, right after the Blackwood incident. The pieces were aligning into a picture none of them wanted to see. Mark found more recent correspondence in the final box, letters between Dr. Slater and film producers, directors, and writers throughout the 1980s and 90s. Slater had been consulting on horror films, providing details from his cases. He was feeding information to filmmakers, Mark said. But why? A document at the bottom of the box provided a chilling answer. Slater's personal journal with an entry from 1996. Crane was right about one thing. Fear is contagious. By introducing these carefully curated horrors into popular culture, we observe how they ripple outward, sometimes inspiring new manifestations. The films serve as both documentation and experiment. The curator oversees all, selecting which stories deserve preservation and which require reinterpretation. They sat in stunned silence until the door opened and Margaret returned. "Finding what you need?" she asked pleasantly. Eliza closed the journal. "Yes, thank you. This is very helpful for our research." "Excellent. The Foundation is always pleased to assist serious scholars. By the way, we have additional materials you might find interesting. Video interviews with Dr. Slater conducted shortly before his death. They're in our media room if you'd care to view them." Daniel and Mark exchanged glances. "That would be extremely helpful," Daniel replied. As they followed Margaret down a corridor, Mark whispered to the others, "We need to copy whatever we can. This goes way beyond an article or documentary now." The media room was a small theatre with plush seats facing a projection screen. Margaret started the video and excused herself, leaving them alone with the flickering image of an elderly Dr. Slater. The interview began benignly enough, with Slater discussing his career in psychiatry, but 30 minutes in, the interviewer, never shown on camera, asked about the curator. Slater's demeanor changed subtly. The curator understands that fear must be managed, channeled. Random violence serves no purpose, but curated horror shapes cultural consciousness. We've been guiding this process for generations. "Is Dr. Crane still involved?" the interviewer asked. Slater smiled thinly. "Lawrence prefers to work directly with subjects now. I focus on the documentation and dissemination aspects. The films are my department. And the new candidates, have you selected them? We're watching several promising individuals, people drawn to these stories who might help continue our work." The video ended abruptly. Daniel, Mark, and Eliza sat motionless, the implications hanging in the air between them. "They're recruiting," Mark finally said, "finding people obsessed with these connections between real crimes and horror films. People like us," Daniel added quietly. The door opened. Margaret stood there with two men in security uniforms. "I hope the video was informative. The curator thought you might appreciate understanding the larger context of your research." Eliza stood. "We need to leave." "No, of course," Margaret smiled. "But first, the curator would like to meet you. It's not often we find 3 individuals who've independently traced our work so effectively. Quite impressive, really." "Who is the curator?" Daniel demanded. "The current curator," Margaret corrected. "It's a position, not a person. A caretaker of our collective work. Please, this way." Daniel noticed the security guards' hands resting on their sidearms. They had little choice but to follow Margaret deeper into the building. "You've been manipulating people for decades," Mark accused as they walked, "creating killers, then turning their crimes into entertainment." "Such a simplistic interpretation," Margaret sighed. "We study the relationship between trauma, fear, and society, how horror narratives shape cultural responses. Sometimes that requires practical demonstrations." She led them to an elevator that took them below ground level. The corridor they entered was clinically white, more reminiscent of a medical facility than an archive. The original curator began this work in the 1950s, Margaret explained conversationally, studying how fear could be induced, controlled, and transmitted. Dr. Crane expanded the methodology in the 70s, and Slater recognized the potential of mass media. Now we're entering a new phase. She stopped before a door. The curator is excited to meet you all, particularly you, Dr. Morales. Your psychological insights would be especially valuable to our ongoing work. As the door swung open, they faced the terrible choice that would define everything that followed. Resist now and face unknown consequences, or step forward into the heart of the horror they'd been tracking, in hopes of exposing it to the world. Chapter 4. The room beyond the door resembled a comfortable study rather than the sterile laboratory they had expected. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with academic texts on psychology, film theory, and criminal behavior. A large desk dominated one end, while comfortable seating was arranged around a coffee table at the other. Behind the desk sat an elderly man, perhaps in his early 80s, with piercing blue eyes and a posture that suggested vigor despite his age. He rose as they entered, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "I'm Dr. Lawrence Crane. I believe you've been looking for me, though you know me better as the curator." Daniel felt a chill run through him. Dr. Crane, the man responsible for patient 217's transformation, supposedly dead according to official records, was very much alive and apparently leading this entire operation. "Please, sit," Crane gestured to the seating area. The security guards positioned themselves by the door as Margaret took a seat slightly apart from the group. None of them moved. "You've been orchestrating murders for decades," Mark said flatly, "creating killers, then exploiting their crimes for entertainment." Crane sighed. "Such melodrama. What we've done is study the transmission of behavioral patterns through cultural mediums. Fear is humanity's most powerful motivator, Mr. Reynolds. Understanding how it functions, how it spreads, is crucial knowledge." "You tortured patients," Eliza countered, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You deliberately induced psychosis in vulnerable people. Some subjects were institutional, yes," Crane acknowledged, without a hint of remorse. "Others volunteered, believing in our mission. The work has evolved considerably since Blackwood. We're more selective now." Daniel found his voice. "Why bring us here? Why reveal yourselves to us?" Crane smiled again, more genuinely this time. "Because you three represent a rare combination of talents and obsessions. A filmmaker with a passion for authentic horror, a criminologist studying the psychological impact of media representations of violence, a journalist connecting patterns others have missed." He leaned forward. "You've already done exceptional work tracing our legacy. Imagine what you could accomplish as part of it." The implication hung in the air. They were being recruited. "You're insane if you think we'd join you," Mark said. "Am I?" Crane raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Buster, you've been trying to create truly affecting horror for years, always falling short because you lacked access to authentic material. Dr. Morales, your academic work has been circling the same questions we've been answering for decades. And you, Mr. Reynolds, have dedicated your career to exposing hidden truths, even at great personal cost." He stood and walked to a wall where dozens of framed movie posters hung. All horror films they discovered were connected to real crimes. "What we offer is insight few ever glimpse, the machinery behind cultural fear, how it's crafted, distributed, and metabolized by society. By committing murders," Eliza said flatly. "By documenting inevitable human darkness," Crane corrected. "Violence exists with or without us. We simply ensure it serves a purpose, advancing our understanding of fear's transmission." Daniel took a step forward. "The copycat killings after the films, those weren't inevitable. You inspired them." "We observed them," Crane countered. "Different phenomena entirely. though occasionally we've helped potential subjects find their inspiration. Mark had been scanning the room, noting possible exits, cameras, and the positions of the guards. People know we're here. If anything happens to us, nothing is happening to you, Crane interrupted, seeming genuinely offended. This is a job interview, not a hostage situation. If you choose to leave, you're free to go. Though I should mention that everything you've discovered thus far has been carefully curated for your consumption. The files, the video, even your anonymous tips, all designed to bring you here, to this moment of choice. Daniel felt a wave of nausea. You've been manipulating us from the beginning. We've been evaluating you, Margaret corrected, seeing how far you'd follow the breadcrumbs, how you'd piece together the fragments. And you've performed admirably, Crane added. Few have traced our work so thoroughly. Fewer still have understood its implications. The Ravenwood Foundation needs fresh perspectives as we enter the digital era. Horror spreads differently now, faster, wider, with new vectors of transmission. Eliza shook her head. You're talking about trauma and suffering as if they're just data points. Because ultimately, that's what they are, Crane replied calmly. Individual suffering is tragic, yes, but the patterns that emerge across populations, that's where the valuable insights lie. The films translate these patterns into cultural artifacts, allowing us to study how fear spreads beyond direct experience. And you think we'd help you continue this? Daniel asked incredulously. Crane studied them each in turn. I think you're already helping us. Mr. Foster, your documentary series will introduce these connections to millions of viewers. Dr. Morales, your academic papers are laying the theoretical groundwork for understanding mediated fear response. Mr. Reynolds, your investigative work is documenting our methodology for future researchers. He returned to his desk and pressed a button. A hidden panel in the wall slid open, revealing a screen displaying surveillance footage. Daniel at Blackwood Sanitarium, Eliza in her university office reviewing case files, Mark working on his evidence wall. You've been watched for months, Crane continued. Your investigations have been guided, your discoveries carefully managed. The question isn't whether you'll help us. You already are. The question is whether you'll do so knowingly, with full access to our resources, or unknowingly, as unwitting vectors in our ongoing work. The offer hung in the air between them. Mark looked at his colleagues, seeing the same horror and uncertainty in their eyes that he felt himself. We need time to discuss this, he finally said, buying moments to think. Of course, Crane nodded. Margaret will show you to a conference room where you can speak privately. Take all the time you need. As they followed Margaret down another corridor, Daniel whispered to the others, we need to alert someone. Police, FBI, anyone. With what evidence? Eliza countered quietly. Everything we have came from them. They've controlled every piece of information we've gathered. We could accept the offer, Mark suggested grimly. Get inside, gather real evidence, then expose everything. And become complicit in whatever they do next? Daniel shook his head. There has to be another way. Margaret showed them into a comfortable conference room. Take your time, there's no rush. The door closed behind her with an audible click. Immediately, Mark checked for surveillance devices while Daniel tried the door. Locked, as expected. They're not letting us leave, Eliza stated flatly. Not unless we agree to their terms. Or appear to agree, Mark corrected. We play along, we get out of here, then we go public with everything we know. Daniel paced the room. They've been doing this for decades without exposure. They've controlled the narrative completely. Even if we tried to tell this story, who would believe us? A heavy silence fell as the truth of their situation sank in. They were being offered a devil's bargain. Complicity in exchange for access to the full scope of the curator's work. After 20 minutes of desperate strategizing, the door opened and Margaret returned. Have you reached a decision? They exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. We need guarantees, Mark said. Proof that we're partners, not prisoners. Margaret smiled. Of course. The curator anticipated this. Come with me. She led them back to Crane's office, where he waited with 3 identical folders on his desk. "Your contracts," he explained, "officially hiring you as research consultants for the Ravenwood Foundation. Substantial compensation, complete creative control over your respective projects, and access to our full archives." "And if we sign these, we're free to leave today?" Eliza asked cautiously. "Naturally," Crane nodded. "This isn't imprisonment, Dr. Morales. It's recruitment. You'll continue your normal lives and careers with the added benefit of our resources and guidance." Daniel stepped forward first, taking one of the folders. "And what exactly would our first assignments be?" Crane's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Mr. Foster, you'll complete your documentary series with exclusive materials we'll provide. Dr. Morales, you'll receive funding for a comprehensive study on media-influenced behavior patterns. Mr. Reynolds, you'll be granted interviews with key figures in our organization for your exposé, though certain details will remain confidential, of course." Mark took his folder. "And future projects? Will we be expected to participate in creating new case studies?" "That would be a natural progression for committed researchers," Crane replied smoothly. "But such opportunities come only after proving one's dedication to the work." Eliza took the final folder, opening it to review the contract within. "These are legitimate legal documents." "The Ravenwood Foundation is a registered research institute," Crane confirmed. "Our public work in media studies and psychological research is entirely above board. Only our most valuable research remains private." As they reviewed the contracts, Mark surreptitiously activated the voice recorder on his phone in his pocket. Whatever happened next, he wanted some record of this encounter. "I have one last question," Daniel said, looking directly at Crane. "Why horror films specifically? Why not documentaries or news reports about these crimes?" Crane seemed pleased by the question. "Horror as a genre speaks directly to the unconscious. It bypasses rational filters, embedding fear responses more deeply than factual presentations ever could. Fiction allows for emotional truths that transcend mere facts. The best horror films don't just depict violence, they transmit its psychological impact, creating a contagion of fear that spreads far beyond those directly affected by the original events." His explanation was delivered with the passion of a true believer, someone who had dedicated his life to this twisted research. "And now," Crane continued, "I need your decision. Join us in understanding fear's architecture, or return to your limited perspectives on its fragments." The 3 looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Whatever they decided in this moment would define their lives going forward: complicity, resistance, or something in between. Daniel took a pen from the desk. "I think we're ready to sign." Ndato, what happened next would determine whether they became part of the curator's collection of fear merchants, or whether they could somehow break the cycle of manipulation and exploitation that had turned real human suffering into entertainment for decades. The true horror, they now realized, wasn't in the films or even the crimes that inspired them. It was in the calculated machinery behind both, the cold, systematic harvesting of fear for purposes beyond their comprehension. As Daniel's pen hovered above the contract, he made his choice. One that would ripple outward through their lives and the lives of countless others, just as the curator had planned all along.